Welcome to Keto Life Support, where we make your keto life sustainable, fun, and low stress. I'm Kim Howerton, and I'll be coming to you weekly with some of my keto besties to bring you the practical, real-world keto advice that you need. Quick disclaimer, I am not a doctor, and even if we do have a doctor in the house from time to time, he or she is not your doctor, and nothing we say on this show should be taken as medical advice. Always check in with a trusted medical professional about your own personal medical concerns. Hello and welcome to Keto Life Support. This is Kim Howerton, and this is episode number 180. And today we're going to be talking about metabolic health. Some of you, or all of you, or most of you will probably know that I have written a book with the illustrious Dr. Ken Berry called Common Sense Labs. And in that book, one of the underlying threads, we call it out in part, but really it's behind so much of this book, is this thread of metabolic health and how important metabolic health is to your overall health, really. And so I just thought I would give you a little bit of a history lesson and talk a little bit about some of these concepts. And if you have the book, you'll know that I am talking about what is in the current edition, page 37-ish, in that general vicinity, but really a lot of what's in the whole book. So once upon a time, there was a doctor named Dr. Jerry Revens, and he came up actually with what at the time was called Syndrome X, which sounds very mysterious, but later better named Metabolic Syndrome. It's basically a coming together of a lot of health problems based in a metabolic sort of underpinning that basically destroys the foundation of your health when these things start going wrong. And he gave the 5 criteria by which we diagnose Syndrome X, which then became Metabolic Syndrome. And those are actually listed in the book, but I will tell you them so you don't have to read along with me. It was based on blood pressure, your fasting glucose and A1C, your triglycerides, your HDL, and your waist measurement. These markers were diagnostic. Now, you were considered to have full-blown metabolic syndrome when you had 3 of these factors out of range. However, it wasn't an all or nothing thing. One of these factors puts you in poorer, that's a hard word to say, poorer metabolic health than having none. 2 is worse than 1, 3 is worse, right? But they had to draw a line somewhere and say, hey, if you've got 3 of these, you are a full-blown metabolic syndrome disasterment right there. So let's talk about the cutoffs. For blood pressure, it was being above 120/80. So that's saying like, this is the cutoff point. It doesn't mean that, it's like all bad, all good over the line. But whenever we're diagnosing, by we, I mean doctors, not me, whenever people are diagnosing who can diagnose, which is not me, I'm telling you about these things, not diagnosing anyone, not a doctor. All right, moving on. So when doctors see someone above 120/80, if you're looking for metabolic syndrome, that is a check mark in the not good box, right? So you want to be below or at or below 120/80. Fasting glucose, they set the diagnostic line at over 100 milligrams per deciliter. We're doing this American style, people, so bear with me. And the A1C under 5.7, so 5.7 or under. So when you were over those numbers, if you were over 100 milligrams per deciliter fasting glucose or had an A1C over 5.7, then you were in the checkbox bad category. Triglycerides, to be good, you were under 150 milligrams per deciliter. You don't want to be over that. These are still the criteria they use when they look at the syndrome. I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a minute. HDL, if it is over 50 milligrams per deciliter for women, that is good. It is over 40 milligrams per deciliter for men, that is good. So you don't want to be under those numbers being diagnostic. Now, it gets confusing sometimes, right? Because for some of these, you want to be over, for some of them, you want to be under. Like triglycerides, you want to be under 150. HDL, you want to be over 50 or 40. Waist measurement, and this is how they did it. So they didn't do the height to waist thingy. I think that's better. But in this diagnosis criteria, they went with, for women, you wanted to be under 34 and a half inches at or under, and for men at or under 40 inches at the waist. So those were the original criteria, and that is actually what they still use today when looking at this. So if you've ever seen a study like, there was a very famous study, Arroyo et al., 2019, where they basically did an analysis of a bunch of studies, a meta-analysis, I believe it was, and they found that only 88% of the population in the United States didn't have at least one of these problems metabolically. Actually, in more recent years, it looks like that number has even dropped to something like 7%, doesn't fall out of range on at least one of these. So those are the original criteria. Unfortunately, I believe Gerald Reaven has passed away, but he is a real groundbreaker on showing the world the importance of these metabolic health markers. Now, I and Dr. Berry both feel personally, and him professionally, that some of these numbers are even a little too generous. We know, for instance, that an A1C of 5.7 is too high. That basically anything over 5.4, you're seeing micro damage in the vascular system from too high occasional and regular blood sugar. So in the book and in our discussion, we often will drop that down lower, that really you want to be under a 5.4 A1C. Whereas there are even some benefits to getting it at 5.0 or below. And so it's, I don't want to say this, the angle of the betterness, right? How much better it is. Going from 5.7 to 5.4, that's super better. But getting from 5.4 to 5.0, that's moderately better, but still better. There don't seem to be additional benefits, like how low can you go? But in the low fives, it's definitely better than the mid fives. And in terms of HDL, there is a bit of a genetic component to that. Some people, especially on keto, will have very high HDL. That does not seem to be a problem. There is some discussion about like sky high HDL, but certainly it can be a little bit over these numbers and you're good, but you don't want HDL to be too low. What's super interesting, right? There are two lipid markers on this list, the trigs, the triglycerides, and the HDL. Notice LDL isn't on this list. Very interesting, right? And so this is one reason why a doctor, even if they don't support that high LDL is always a problem, will still potentially order you a basic lipid panel in an annual labs. And that's actually why it's recommended in our book, so that we can look at trigs and HDL, even though a lot of doctors want to focus on the LDL. So just putting that out there. And then the other thing I would say is that the trigs, they should really be under 100, not under 150. All right, let's just be real with realness sake. Then we've got this waist measurement thingy. And I would say I think it's better to look at the height to waist ratio rather than defining it as a strict cutoff. Why is that? Well, I'm 5'9", and for me, being 34 and a half inches of waist is probably great and important. But gosh, if I were like 5 feet tall and you were saying that my waist could be up to 34 and a half, that would be a fairly, I would imagine that would still indicate a bit too much abdominal fat, right? And why do we care about abdominal fat? Mostly we care about abdominal fat because that can indicate visceral fat, which is fat around our organs. And so there can be some nuance here, right? If your fat is grabby and jiggly, that tends to be more subcutaneous, which is potentially not as metabolically damaging, but it's something to look at. So anyway, I prefer height to waist, which basically means you want your waist measurement to be no more than half your height. So if you're 5 feet tall, that's 60 inches, then you don't want your waist to be any more than 30. Now, I will tell you that I find with a lot of people, the weight, especially middle-aged people, the waist measurement is the last one to fall in place when they're getting more metabolically healthy. So direction matters more than speed. This is not all or nothing, black or white. It's cumulative, it's additive. Just as I said at the beginning, if you're going with one is worse than none, well, one is still better than two, right? So reducing these, being in the good category, being in the yes category, however you want to say it, being in the positive is great. But this isn't the be all end all list of metabolic health. All of these things matter. All of these things are important to track, but there are some other markers. In fact, almost more than I could list on this podcast. And that's why in the book, we list a whole bunch of annual labs, many of which have to do with your metabolic health. But some really pointed ones that we would say you can look at, not just how it gets wrapped up in your metabolic health, but you can look at almost diagnostically, would be looking at a C-peptide and a fasting insulin. Now, with your C-peptide, there's kind of a great category and there's a good category. And so if you're not yet to good, go to good. And then if you're good, work on great, right? It's a continuum. Same thing with fasting insulin. So what's the good category for C-peptide? Oh, I'll stop and say, what is a C-peptide? So a C-peptide is a connecting peptide. That's what the C is for. And each C-peptide is connected to an insulin molecule. So for every insulin molecule you produce, you also produce a C-peptide molecule. We test insulin directly with a fasting insulin test. We test insulin indirectly with a C-peptide test. Why are we wanting to look at both? Well, because insulin itself is very changeable. If I tested your insulin in the morning versus midday versus the afternoon versus after a meal versus fasted, it'd be all over the place. And so unless you're testing insulin throughout the day, like getting like 5 or 6 blood tests and tracking it, that can be very helpful. That's actually an oral glucose tolerance test with insulin is how you do is that. But any given moment, an insulin level might be a little weird, even fasted. If you get a horrible night's sleep and you go and get your fasting insulin tested, it might be double what it would be on any other day. So that means it's kind of hard to use it diagnostically by itself, right? Because it's changeable. This is unfortunately true of many readings, such as fasting glucose, really changeable day to day based on a number of factors. But the C-peptide is a little more stable. And so because of that stability of the C-peptide, when you look at C-peptide connected to that fasting insulin, when you look at them both, then you've kind of got like a check. You've got checks and balances of your blood work. So we're looking at, we want C-peptide between 0.5 and 1.99, so under 2 nanograms per milliliter, okay? Optimal, though, is between 0.5 and 1.7, so just a scooch lower. Now, why don't we want it as low as possible? Why don't we start that number at 0? We want it between 0 and 1 or something like that, right? It's because you need some. You need some insulin. So this is true of both fasting insulin and C-peptide. If your insulin or your C-peptide is much below the bottom points of these ranges, we start to become concerned that you might be either a type 1 diabetic or LADA. There are a bunch of different types of insulin insufficiencies that can come up that basically are a form of diabetes. So we don't want that. So you need some. You just do not want a lot. All right. So fasting insulin, very good with between like 2 and 8 IUs, international units per milliliter. Optimal, we say, is often under 5. Some people say 6. The jury is out. There's a little bit of debate there. We do find, though, most of the time as long as someone has sufficient insulin, they're not a type 1 diabetic or a related type of diabetes, and it gets very, very low to the low end of that scale, like below 3, say, international units, often they're very athletic, right? So going on a low carb diet, fixing the diet, it does seem to push it more to that like 4, 5, 6, 7 arena. And then if someone is also low carb and very athletic, that's when it seems to drift much lower, and or they're fasting a lot and or they don't eat a lot, right? There can be a lot of reasons that goes down. But, if I were making some generalizations, the leaner you are at a certain point, the lower that's going to go. But I've seen some people who are still quite a bit on the fluffy side who get it down to 5 or 6, no problem. But again, remember, insulin is a little noisy. If you're somebody that has a lot of sleep problems, if you're somebody that has a lot of stress, that is going to drive up that insulin in a way that you might be like, I'm eating carnivore. This is nuts. Why isn't my insulin lower? Right? I can't get it much lower. And there's more than food involved in this story. Now, there are some other things we potentially look at when we're looking at metabolic health. And one that a lot of people overlook or misattribute. I'm going to point a few others out today. This is not on that page in the book, but I thought let's go for a little extra credit. And that is uric acid. Let's talk about uric acid a little bit. Now, we know about uric acid often from people having gout, right? Gout is this big, scary thing. Rightly so. It's very painful to have a gout attack. I thankfully have never had one. And so we look at uric acid, but in fact, I honestly believe, and Dr. Berry and I have had discussions about this. I'm not alone in this. I'm not like, I have discovered this. Other people think this too, that uric acid, more than almost anything else, is a marker of metabolic health. It's less about how much purines you're getting, although that is in the equation. And it can be very much related to overconsumption of fructose and alcohol. And so one of the things that I think is important to look at is uric acid levels. Why, right? It correlates highly with metabolic health. And so the recommended levels in our book, they are a bit gender-based or sex-based. So we've got uric acid for females. The standard recommendation is between 1.4 and 5.8 grams per deciliter. We would say optimal for women is between 2.5 and 5.5 grams per deciliter. And for men, it's standard 3.7 to 8.6 grams per deciliter, optimal being between 3.5 and 8.5. Now, one of the things I will tell you, like I can tell you from my personal blood work, is my uric acid when I was unhealthy was always a little bit on the high side for the woman's numbers anyway, in the 6s. And as I became more metabolically healthy, I found my numbers dropped. Now my uric acid is in the 4s. And so that was not in any way me eating less meat. That was me eating probably more meat and being more metabolically healthy. So that's something to look at. Even eating some fruit. By the way, my uric acid was, so sometimes people freak out about uric acid because of the fructose thing, or rather they freak out about fruit because of the fructose thing, because of the uric acid thing. And as I've become more metabolically healthy, I've reintroduced fruit into my diet. And it's not like I'm a fruitarian people, but I have some fruit in my diet. And even with that, still in the 4s. So it's really about an overall metabolic health picture. And then the other thing we want to look at potentially is how is your liver doing? Because your liver really comes into play with your metabolic health. So what are we looking at there? We're looking at GGT, which I believe is gamma glutamate transferase. Most people just say GGT. And so standard for that is anything under 65, but you really don't want to see those high numbers. This is international units per liter is the units. I'm trying to give units so those of you in other countries aren't like, but what? That's confusing. So you can do a translation on that. And optimal, you really want that sucker under 30 or even a little less, maybe under 25, right? So you want that GGT lower. It indicates that your liver is doing better. The other ones to look at would be the ALT and the AST, which used to be called the SGOT and the SGPT, but now they're called the ALT and the AST. So the ALT standard is under 44 international units per liter. You really want that sucker under 26. AST standard under 40. Again, you want it under 26, somewhere in the 10 to 26 range. So those 3 are going to be really important liver markers that tell you about fatty liver potential or not. And so you want to look at those in terms of your metabolic health. You also want to look potentially at homocysteine. So what is homocysteine? It's a little bit of a confusing one for some people. So I thought I should call that out. Homocysteine is also something we look at in terms of metabolic health. An interesting thing about homocysteine, it's very related, high homocysteine is very related to blood clots and cardiovascular disease, but it is something that we see elevated in people with metabolic syndrome. But one thing that it can also indicate is a B vitamin deficiency. So it's a good thing to look at if you might need to look at your B vitamins to adjust your homocysteine down. So I don't want to get confusing. There are certain things that if you have metabolic syndrome, that can affect a lot of things. And we're not like isolated little silos in our body. Everything affects everything. And so I'm not saying you only need to worry about these markers, but these are specifically important markers that I would say we'd potentially want to look at. And, it all works together in various ways. Like when you have metabolic syndrome, you might be more likely to then have high acute phase reactants. You might be likely to have high CRP. You might be likely to have high ferritin. You might be likely to have high ferritin with low iron, right? So that these various things can come together. Also, having metabolic syndrome potentially might make you more likely to have thyroid dysregulation, and or having thyroid dysregulation can make you more likely to have metabolic syndrome. So it can go around and around. And so we need to look at all of them, which is why there's a whole suite of tests to look at, not just the ones that I've brought up today. But those can be some very important places to check. So I just wanted to do this little overview of what is important around metabolic health and monitoring it. There are obviously some other things we can look at and we can hope to see improve over time. But again, I like to point out that it's about progress, not perfection. And working on these levels can mean that in the long term, you're going to be a much healthier individual. Though you already know that, and I'm stating the obvious, I just wanted to put it out there that it's really, again, more about direction. It's more about heading in the right one. And I know you all are doing that. So I'm here if you have questions. If you don't have the book yet, you can find a link to it at commonsenselabbook.com. You can find it on Amazon, but that link will get you right there if you need it. All right, guys, take care, and I will talk to you next week.
Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Keto Life Support. Want more information? Want show notes? Want to suggest a topic? Just head over to ketolifesupport.com. That's where all that kind of thing can go on. By the way, I have a request. If you could go to your podcast host and hit subscribe, we would really, really appreciate it. And what would be even more awesome is if you could write a review. And what would be even more awesome than that is if you could write like a really flattering review. Just asking, you do you. All right. So thanks so much for joining us. I'm thrilled that you're part of the Keto fam. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.